Welcome to the Fantasy Source Football Podcast. My name is David A. Arnott, standing here with Sean Merriman and Brad Pinkerton, and we are wrapping up our podcasts for the season by talking about the awards we would give to fantasy performers throughout the season. We're going to be talking about the fantasy MVP, the pickup of the year, the surprise of the year, and the most disappointing player of the year. That one's probably my favorite, I would say. The most disappointing guy. We did a little bit of vitriol out. But, Sean, let's start with you and with your fantasy MVP of this season.
Sure. I'm going to go with the obvious pick here, and that is Green Bay Packers quarterback Aaron Rodgers. As far as points, he's the number one player in all of fantasy football, averaging over 26 points a game, which is impressive in itself. You know, we talk about the idea of maybe waiting on a quarterback in our drafts, but this really makes you think if Rodgers is worth taking that early pick on just because of how valuable he has been this year.
I mean, it's not just total points. It's the gap between him and the number 12 quarterback. That's something a lot of fantasy managers like to look at, is the gap between the top guy and then the bottom starter. He's just in a different world.
Well, that's the thing. 8 of the top 10 scorers are quarterbacks, but when you look at the difference between Rodgers were those next 2, 3, 4 guys, it's significant.
Brad, who do you have as your fantasy MVP? Are you agreeing with Sean on that one?
Well, he's absolutely right. From a point standpoint, it is Aaron Rodgers. You know, he's head and shoulders above the rest of the crowd. But really, when you look at a guy who showed consistency at an increasingly frustrating position, running back, LaShawn McCoy, to me, stands out as an MVP candidate with a touchdown in all but one game this year. And even that one game he didn't score, he still racked up over 100 rushing yards. He's been there week in and week out for his owners, and he really can't put a price on that. So maybe he's the most invaluable fantasy player of the season.
So you put more, to use another, still using the vague term value, you put more value on that type of performance than, say, Arian Foster, who has put up close to the same total number of points, but in something like 3 fewer full games.
Well, true, because I've had him from week one. I've had LaShawn McCoy in the lineup and didn't have to think about it once.
Oh, so, I mean, there you go. So that just the week in, week out, okay, that's it. He's in, forget it.
Absolutely.
He's awesome. All right, well, what about the pickup of the year? A guy you would say, Brad, that should have been on everybody's radar in the middle, at some point in the middle season, and has totally outperformed what everybody would have thought when they picked him up.
Yeah, and to me, this has to be a guy that really wasn't drafted unless you were taking a complete flyer and you were in the 1 percentile. But I'm looking at Victor Cruz as pickup of the year. He came out of nowhere. When he busted out in week 3, I believe it was, when he had his first huge game, we were all a little skeptical, including myself, thinking that, you know, how is he going to produce behind Hakeem Nicks, behind Mario Manningham, another popular preseason sleeper? Well, here we are, you know, post week 14. He's leading the Giants in receptions, yards, and touchdowns, and that's pretty impressive. Or receiving touchdowns, so that's pretty solid from just a waiver wire pickup.
I mean, he's doing so well that it kind of opens up the question about how much has Eli Manning actually improved, because Victor Cruz is such a huge addition to that team, and you know, while sort of coming out of nowhere. I think George Winkler referred to him as a preseason wonder. How many other types of those guys who something like 2-3 years in a row or in college or whatever seem to have is on everybody's radar and then just completely disappear, and then all of a sudden it does work out.
Yep, and that was even a couple of years ago when he had that outstanding preseason and then just disappeared and then never got a chance. But this year he got that chance and he's capitalized on it.
Sean, who do you have tabbed as the midseason pickup of the year?
Well, I'm going to go with the guy who's currently rivaling Barack Obama as the most popular man in the world right now, and that'd be Tim Tebow. Tebow was a guy that wasn't drafted by a lot of people simply because he wasn't starting at the beginning of the year. Kyle Orton was the starter there. Orton gets dropped. Tebow has his chance. The rest is all history, as we know. He's been great since taking over. He's led me to the finals in one league. It's been beyond impressive. And, of course, obviously, if you are an owner, that comes with sweating it out for 3 quarters. But in that 4th quarter, he makes it worth it. He scores, it seems, between 14 and 20 points every game he's out there.
I mean, say what you will about his real-life value, and we're not really going to get into that with this because there's no real analogy between it. When you get down to the sheer fantasy value, as you say, he's going to rack up those points just because he runs the ball so much.
Yep, and he's been outstanding in the 4th quarter, like I said. I think I saw a stat last night that next to Eli Manning, he has the most passing yards in the 4th quarter in the past 5 or 6 games.
So while Tebow might have been one of the more surprising players in this year, given given what he did last year, it's not necessarily that surprising that he would be successful and have his team winning and racking up fantasy points. Sean, who are you most surprised by this year from a fantasy perspective?
Yeah, I'm going to go with a duo of tight ends, and that being Rob Gronkowski and Jimmy Graham. Tight end is a position that, often we overlook in our drafts. We're kind of passing on them, focusing on the quarterbacks, running backs, and receivers early on. But with Gronkowski and Graham, Gronkowski has already topped 200 points this fantasy season in standard scoring leagues. Not one receiver in all of fantasy football has done that, including Kelvin Johnson and Wes Welker. Jimmy Graham is a guy that next to Johnson and Welker, he would have the most points at 160. So to look at those guys, and then you think about the next person after those two would be Tony Gonzalez, who is around 120. So again, like we talked about with Rodgers, it's a significant gap from the top to where the next tier starts. Graham and Gronkowski were both guys that Graham was kind of a middle to late rounder. Gronkowski was late, if even drafted, just because of sharing time with Aaron Hernandez. But that timeshare is gone. Gronkowski has been absolutely incredible this season.
And adding to that, I seem to recall that Gronkowski was clearly the second tight end in New England by most fantasy people's evaluation. Because, Hernandez had a better year last year.
Mm-hmm. Yep, Gronkowski's been a guy that, would catch touchdowns, but the yardage has never been up there like Hernandez. Hernandez was a guy who would catch 5 to 6 balls a game, and now it's complete role reversal, and I don't know if we've seen a tight end this impressive as Gronkowski has been.
Brad, who do you have tabbed as your surprise of the year?
Well, this isn't just a homer pick. I think a lot of people are surprised by the success Cam Newton has had as a rookie.
I'm raising my hand.
Right out of the gate, 400-yard passing game in his first NFL start. That's crazy. And then he did it again in week 2. To me, that is the biggest surprise, and especially in a year where training camps were shortened. We were expecting the rookies to have an even steeper learning curve than usual and come in and just struggle right out of the gate. He did the opposite and actually dominated. And now we're looking at him as a top 5 fantasy quarterback because of not necessarily his arm, but the dynamic rushing ability he brings. He still has to figure out how to cut down on the interceptions. He's got some throwing mechanics to work out like that, but he's got some weapons in Carolina, and we're looking at maybe a top 5 fantasy quarterback for his career.
The crazy thing that I see when I look at it from the wider perspective is that 2 years ago he was playing at a community college, and while dominating at a community college, it wasn't like this was preordained the way it was with someone like Peyton Manning, and yet Cam Newton is probably having the best rookie season a quarterback has ever had, Mr. Manning included.
Yep.
And so it's absolutely insane that not only is he throwing fairly decently for a rookie, but he's their goal line running back. I seem to recall a stat that Jonathan Stewart and D'Angelo Williams had something like single-digit runs inside the 10-yard line total the entire season. Because you know what? You got a 6'6", 260-pound guy who can run just as fast as they can.
And he's not scared to get hit.
No, not at all. Now, as I alluded to at the beginning, the most fun award to give, just because now we can laugh at it, I think. During the season, it wasn't so funny. The most disappointing fantasy players. Brad, who you got labeled for that one?
This is always the toughest one because it seems like there's so many candidates and there's so much bitterness right now to get out, heading into the fantasy playoffs. But for me, I think just overall, it's Chris Johnson. The year started out on a very bad foot with the holdout.
Even though he's come on strong in the last couple of weeks?
Even though he's come on strong, it's too little too late. For a lot of fantasy owners have already sank with him. And as a matter of fact, even some of these breakout games might have come on benches at that point. So fantasy owners are probably just looking back at a very frustrating season, and looking at first-round picks, he's got to be in the conversation as the most frustrating and the most disappointing of the season.
Among the non-injured players, because Jamal Charles got taken just as soon as Johnson did.
Yeah, I think there's plenty of injury guys you can look at and say, well, that was disappointing, but out of their control. So a guy who's been healthy all year and just constantly disappointing is Chris Johnson.
Okay, Sean, get out that vitriol.
Sure. As far as running backs go, you mentioned the injuries, and one of the guys I was kind of thinking about was maybe Peyton Hillis, who's been disappointing, but he's had some injuries as well. Then I kind of narrowed my search to maybe D'Angelo Williams, but like you said, with Johnson, he's had a few decent games as of late. So I'm going to go with who I believe is the biggest bust of all, and that would be Chad Ocho Cinco, or Stinko is what you want to call it. People have drafted him in the middle to high rounds, I remember. You in our experts league took him.
Yep.
Sorry to bring that up.
Oh,
Maybe
yeah,
a
that was,
subject,
as a Hillis and Ocho Cinco draftee, not good times.
Yeah, and I think I looked at he was drafted in the 6th round in our experts league. 22 total fantasy points heading into week 15 here. Ranks 117th among fantasy wide receivers in standard scoring leagues. So, you can't get much worse than that, especially when he goes into an offense like that in New England. So much high expectations for playing with Tom Brady, and he's just been invisible.
I'm pretty sure that there was nobody drafted in the top 6 rounds of our league that was uninjured and was that completely ineffective. I mean, you said it right there, 22 fantasy points?
Yep, exactly.
You sure it's 22 and
That's
not like 18?
I would argue that maybe Jamal Charles outscored him in the one game he played.
Yeah, I mean, you make a compelling argument for the guy who was drafted fairly highly. I mean, a first-round pick flaming out is completely unheard of. And as we kind of got to, Chris Johnson, he was a borderline RB2 for most of the year.
Yeah.
I mean, not the top 5 pick that you expected, but you still got something out of him. Chad Ochocinco
gave you nothing.
Nothing. I think I dropped him by week 5. Anyway, do I get bonus points for cutting bait soon? Anyway. Well, guys, thank you for joining us on the podcast. I want to thank everybody else, all the Fantasy Source experts that were on this podcast throughout the season. We're going to have something to do with baseball, some kind of audio, some kind of video, whatever you may think. And, of course, there are also all sorts of videos that we're going to be doing on Fantasy Source, baseball and football throughout the year. So I hope all of you guys who are listening right now check it out. All right, guys, thanks for joining us.
Good luck in the playoffs.